Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by RedThread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. We just barely finished talking to Matthew Daniel, who is a senior principal for talent strategy and mobility at Guild. He's also a longtime friend of RedThread. We love him and the smart things he said. He was actually one of our very first guests. Today, we talked about the half-life of a workplace skill. Matthew dove in and did some research into where that came from and did a little bit of a debunking for us. So, Stesia, what stood out to you in this conversation?
I really appreciated how Matthew followed the trail of the sniff test, right? This whole notion of a half-life skill didn't really seem to make sense, particularly when you just apply it broadly with no sense of granularity. And as it turns out, it's from 1967, which is terrifying. But what I think I appreciated was then kind of thinking through how that concept might apply differently to durable skills and perishable skills, which is two concepts he didn't bring together in the article that he wrote. So kind of thinking through, okay, like when might this still hold up as a concept, not as research, but as a concept, versus when is it really just not relevant at all? How about for you?
I mean, the whole thing was fascinating. It was a little bit of a mea culpa moment because I'm the one that put out the infographic that started the whole half-life of workplace skill thing. So part of it was just talking to somebody that had done that research and could debunk that. I thought that was incredibly valuable. And his point of the things we take for granted on the face and not diving into the research or having a questioning mind or thinking critically about them was a really big thing. Matthew is also an expert on skills. I'm always interested to hear his thoughts on what's new in the world of skills and what isn't. I think one of the things that he said that we've also been seeing is maybe not a blanket strategy for skills across the organization, but thinking critically about what skills the organization needs, which ones are critical to the success of the organization, focusing there and figuring out how to work that out. He also mentioned that maybe our technology today doesn't quite allow us to have the context we need around the skills in order to make really good decisions, which I thought was an excellent point.
I agree. That one around the technology and thinking through particularly context as well as degree of capability. We're hearing some folks work on the degree, but context seems to be a gap that we're still seeing with the tech.
Yeah, for sure. It was a fantastic conversation. We will provide a link to Matthew's article in the show notes as well. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and subscribe. And if you are interested in any of the research that we talk about in the podcast, please join RedThread. Thanks so much for listening.
If you like what you heard today, check out our RedThread Research membership. We have a wonderful community. We have studies and research that we publish on a range of people practices as well as HR technology. And we also have discussions on a regular basis, including virtual meetups and all sorts of other things to get you connected to the insights you need to solve your biggest people problems. Check us out at members.redthreadresearch.com.
Welcome, Matthew, to Workplace Stories. It's good to have you here again.
Oh, so good to be back with you.
We like to start each podcast with just a little bit of information about yourself. So the first question is, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I guess I'll start with, I'm a dad. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm an HR talent L&D nerd and have been for 20 plus years. I have been in this field since the day I graduated from college, literally the day. And have spent a number of years either as a consultant in the L&D space. I was in-house at Capital One for 6 years leading learning tech and was an early adopter of Workday Skill. That's how I got into the skill stuff, was figuring out what that looked like from an enterprise standpoint. And today I work for a company called Guild. And my role at Guild is kind of to understand what's happening in the market, almost like an internal analyst. What is happening in the market? Make sure that Guild understands that and then help for Guild speak to the market. Sometimes it's advisory work for our clients to help them understand some things. And so it's a whole lot of fun. And hopefully my experience as a practitioner shines through as I'm thinking about what's happening in the industry. It's an interesting time to be in the space.
Yeah, it sure is. I think you've kind of answered this, but I want to just clarify, maybe have you put a little cherry on the top, if you will, of why should we listen to you?
Oh, I don't know. This is going to be a recurring theme during this podcast, I think, as everybody listens, which is like, I'll tell you why I think you should listen to me. And then I think you should bring a healthy dose of skepticism and pragmatism to every conversation. So yes, 20 years in this, doing it in a lot of enterprise situations, either as an advisor or a practitioner, working with a number of the vendors in the space, understanding what they're capable of, and then importantly, working at Guild on skills and how should we do it? What's our approach to it? I'll also say this, I write and speak a lot, and hopefully the novel insights that I bring to the market bring me credibility. Like, that's what I hope. I think the people who are listening to this and you all have to be the judge of that. But this is the question that probably made me the most nervous, because I think as we go through this podcast, we're going to talk about maybe some ideas that people put out into the world that weren't fully baked or that were hyperbolic, or I don't know how you want to frame the initial piece of this, but ultimately, I think whatever I say, or anyone who's on this podcast, or anyone who's writing an article, I hope that the people who are engaging with this are really thinking deeply about this and the so what, now what, and what comes next of anything that I say here. But I really appreciate the opportunity to come chat with you all about it. We'll let folks listening be the judge.
We always love it when you come. We had a checkup about, what was it, like a month and a half ago? And during that checkup, you brought up the fact that you brought up the fact that you're doing some research on the half-life of a workplace skill. So as we start this conversation, it's going to be a lot about where that came from and how valid it is and all that kind of stuff. But just to start, where did you hear the phrase, the half-life of a workplace skill is 2.5 to 5 years?
So it feels like this half-life of skills has always been the ether, but in particular, there was an infographic that came out of Deloitte 8 or 10 years ago. Danny, that's where you come in. We'll talk about that in a second, I'm sure. And this infographic got sent around everywhere. You started seeing it. If you were in corporate L&D, I was at Capital One at the time, and like people were taking screenshots and sending it out. And it has a couple different things on it. It's about how people get interrupted, or the amount of attention, how many hours a week they have to devote to skilling. I remember that was a part of the infographic. But in particular, there was the half-life of the skill is 5 years, closer to 2.5 years if it's a technical skill. And then that data point got picked up by everybody. Like if you're selling services or a product in the learning space, the half-life of skills has come into a blog post, a podcast, or something. The World Economic Forum republished it in 2017, and that lent a lot of credibility to that concept. And then it just it's everywhere. It's in the HBR articles, it's in BCG's articles, it's the whole alphabet soup quotes this thing. And I think it was really good in the beginning, right? Trying to create urgency in our ability to respond. But that's where it first came up. I'm going to turn the tables here for just a second. I want to know how you might play into this story of the half-life of skills.
I could throw somebody else under the bus. I was brand new at Deloitte. I had just barely joined the Burson by Deloitte research team. And my manager, I am not going to throw him under the bus, but my manager had said, hey, I have this great idea. There's all this really great information about crowdedness and blah, 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 blah. And here's some data. Put together an infographic that we can get some eyes on. And so I did.
You are the creator of the infographic.
All of the sources. I was new. I didn't check all the sources. And yes, the infographic is my fault. It's a very nice infographic and says a lot of really good things. This little piece, the 2.5 to 5 years, is the piece that blew up. Like everything else is sort of forgotten except for this, like 2.5 to 5 years.
Okay, can I pause us though? Some folks are not learning folks. What the heck does a half-life of a skill even mean?
Okay.
Like, let's make sure that everyone's on the same page here before we go how ridiculous this thing got.
Okay, wait. So, like, this is where I want everybody to remember back to high school chemistry. The basic idea behind this is that radioactive isotopes of elements break apart over time. If you ever hear anybody say, and Chernobyl will be radioactive for the next 45 years, that's what they mean, is how long does it take for that thing to break down? This concept was applied to skills at some point. Somebody said, oh, you know what? This makes sense. All skills don't live in perpetuity. Someone out there said the half-life of skills is 5 years and the technical skills being closer to 2.5 years. And so what they were implying is, look, over time, the relevancy of a skill, the ability to apply that skill, it breaks down. Some of it is still valuable. There are pieces of it that you pull forward, but there are lots of pieces that become irrelevant over time as technology changes around us or processes or those kind of things change around us. So that was the idea behind it, is that skills dissipate in value.
But so that is assuming, right, that we are not continuously reskilling, upskilling, learning on a given skill. So that is assuming that like my basic level of Excel stays in that spot, right? Like not that I'm learning stuff and getting better.
Yeah, but this is a really interesting example. If you learned how to use Excel 20 years ago, even if you've added skills on top of it, there is nothing less relevant about that right now. Now, we can argue that AI is going to make those basic skills in how you calculate on a spreadsheet much less relevant over the next few years. But let's just say for this point, if you are working not in Excel, but in a worksheet, if we want to go back to the Microsoft Works packages days, the things that you knew how to do in that platform 30 years ago, you actually would use that skill literally right now. You're right, Stacia, that like as I build new skills, it ignores me building new skills. But even it ignores that actually there are skills that don't dissipate value over time. There's always a chance that something is going to change in the next 2 or 3 years. To be clear, my mama taught me how to talk to people, right? Like my mother helped me understand a lot of basics of life. And those skills, I think about those things all of the time. They still enter my vernacular. They enter the work that I do. And I imagine they do for both of you too, right? So I think there's like this, there is a false assumption that that skill isn't going to continue to be updated. But there's also even a false assumption that a skill itself can't retain or won't. This is what I want to get to, Stacia, is that it's a toxic belief. When we take concepts and like we internalize them as beliefs, we start making different decisions as a result of that. And so it's not that the value of skills doesn't fall. The value of some skills certainly does fall for many different reasons.
My MySpace capabilities are really not so relevant anymore.
I mean, but you could pick the right jam for the intro page, right? Like that matters. That still matters when you're making a playlist.
That matters.
Yeah, that's a great example. So I think there are some skills that certainly change because now you're a manager and you're not a doer, or now you're working in an adjacent area, or sometimes the technology changes around you. I don't think any of us would argue that some skills don't lose value over time. I think it's okay to call it like it's a toxic belief that all skills lose value over time because you start to make different decisions as a result of that belief.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. But first, you did a deep dive in this.
Oh,
you were like, where did this ridiculous number come from? And then you went and found it. So let's talk about the history. Like, where did the history of the 2.5 to 5 years of a half-life of a workplace skill come from?
Y'all, can I just be a history nerd for a second? I'm going to do the thing.
Stacia's one too. So for sure, geek out.
You and I together, you know?
Yeah. So here's the thing about it is most of my writing in my job at Guild, I write pretty regularly, but the good stuff that I write, I almost always write in the middle of the night because it's like I wake up and I'm just angry about something in our industry. Like there's something that it just is boiling me over. And I think right before I went to sleep one night, I read something, there was another marketing piece about the half-life of skills. And I thought to myself, God, that's utter BS. When will it ever leave? And I thought, you know what? I'm going to try to play a part in like, I'm going to go do the research. I'm going to find it. And so Danny, I found the infographic and it's like, oh, it sources a book. So I swear to you, I bought the book. I found it online, A New Culture of Learning by Thomas and Brown. Again, I'm the nerd that emailed the authors trying to get them to engage with me. I found their websites and like emailed them. No response, by the way. No response. Couldn't find the quote in the book.
Should always respond.
Yeah, because then it ends up on the podcast. So then I was like, what am I doing? Like after the book arrived, I read the whole book top to bottom, couldn't find the reference or the original citation. And so I started doing research. I'm enrolled in classes. I have access to a school library at University of Denver. And I was like, I'm going to use the school library and I'm going to start doing research. And so I started going really deep. And most of the references, I found references, a lot of it points to Deloitte stuff. And then it goes back further and points to some stuff that came from like the IEEE and the Academy of Sciences in the mid-2000s. And then it goes back further. And I started seeing references to half-life of skills from a congressional hearing of all things in 1983, which PS is the year I was born, just so we know. Now, here's why I mention it was the year I was born is because I had always had this imagination. If we think about when that infographic came out in a few years after it, the implication in the way it was used is that this was a new thing. The half-life of skills falling was a new thing that we all needed to gear and react differently to. So when I found this reference in 1983 from a congressional hearing, I was like, oh, hold up, y'all. This goes back way, way further than I recognize. So here's what's really interesting is in that testimony, there's this guy, he has a company, he kind of does consulting on occupational metrics. He's an economist, in short. He is saying to everybody, hey, everybody, 1983, the world's changing. And like half of the things, I want to give you the exact quote. The technology half-life is no longer a comfortable 5 years, perhaps 2 years in some technologies, feel familiar. What does such sweeping change imply for the nation's education and training institutions? And then he writes about no important occupation will ever again be current for more than 2 years. This was his claim in 1983, right? And here's what's interesting. He at no point in time said that the half-life of skills was 5 years. He was saying that the knowledge for any job, the body of knowledge for a job is going to change. What is interesting is that the congressman who was overseeing this hearing is the one who actually says, we heard testimony at the end of days of testimony. He says, we heard testimony from an expert that the half-life of skills is 5 years and falling. That's where the actual quote comes from. Except for then you find out, like I kept going back, where's the research? And so there is a particular paper, I don't know, for those of you who have been in the learning space, especially for a number of years, it's the Association for Talent Development now. It was the American Society for Training and Development, ASTD, and they used to have a journal. I found an article in 1967 called On the Obsolescence and Retraining of Engineering Personnel. And this is Dr. Zelikoff. He's at a college in Philadelphia. And he argues in this article with some data that there are 5 types of engineers he looks at: aeronautical, chemical, civil, electrical, mechanical. He's looking at these roles. And essentially what he says is the half-life of knowledge needed for any of these roles changes every 5 years. Well, how did he define that? And the data he used to back that up was actually he went and pulled the curriculum from 5 different colleges for those 5 different programs. And he started in 1935, 35, y'all, almost a century ago, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, and 65, every 5 years. And he started looking at a degradation curve of essentially how much of and get ready for this, the names of the courses, not like the content in the courses, not the objectives. How much did the names of the courses change over any given 5-year period? And he mapped that on a degradation curve. And the point he was making in the paper is essentially that the half-life of knowledge for a given role changes every 5 years. Now, I can get behind that in a 5-year curve for many of us, a lot of knowledge changes. I don't know that I'm going to say half, but he had some numbers, right? He had some data to back up his point of view. It's just that those numbers were course names. And I don't know if you've been at a college, but course names change over time.
Yeah, and it was only 5 colleges.
5 colleges, and it was only 5 programs inside the 5 colleges. And from that, drumroll please, we get the half-life of skills is 5 years. And that's
in 1967.
In 1967. I think my mom was born that year. I don't know. It's this urgency, a false urgency, and frankly, like a false precision that everybody in HR is walking around going like, oh God, we've got to map all our skills. We've got to figure out the entire ecosystem because it's all changing so quickly. Like there's this panic based on research that we haven't even gone back to validate and think about, is this actually true? Or is this just a really helpful narrative to position the initiative that we want to drive in our organization?
That never happens. Matthew, everybody does their research. Everyone.
I just want to say this makes me so happy. Like in that, anyone who just follows the trail back to the origin, it's so important. As a historian, you know, it's so important. Read original documents. Go find the thing. Don't just accept what you hear. So it makes me so happy on that level that you did this. It makes me horrified where we are right now with what happened.
Yeah, because I think what is fear-inducing for me, or maybe maddening is the best word for me to use, is the number of decisions that have been made in the decades since that stat really became prevalent everywhere. If I go back and look at some of the decisions that were being made around microlearning, again, I'm going to bring up examples. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on any one of these individual industries. I think we have had like rushes to buy platforms and to buy content libraries and to reimagine the whole way that HR works, because embedded in our minds was this belief that skills were always changing. We were on this show 3.5 years ago. We recorded the episode together, the three of us, 3.5 years ago. And one of the things I was railing against, I was re-listening to that podcast this week. One of the things I was railing against and spent a lot of time railing against was this idea of mapping every skill in the organization, right? Mapping 30,000 skills. I tried at Capital One. It was abysmal. It was not good. Now, what we know, Danny, Stacia, listening to this podcast, there are some people who are still doing that. But the vast majority of people that you all interview have started to really narrow down the number of skills they talk about, have started to really narrow down, maybe by field, maybe by department, different things that they all index on. But they've really started to focus on a handful of skills that they believe are critical. That's the other thing that's happened, is it's not like, let's just map all the skills for skills' sake. It's like, let's find the actual skills that matter to our business strategy. That's what we should be anchoring our skills strategy to. And so you see this maturity. But I do wonder if we all weren't running around afraid that the half-life of skills was going to eat us alive as a business, would we have been more thoughtful in the beginning about being focused on a handful of skills? Would it have swung as hard as it did, this pendulum towards massive skill mapping? There are people listening to this right now. I mean, again, there are folks who have seen this all the way through, put a ton of energy to it, and been really successful. Kudos to them. But there are a lot more people listening to this who spent years getting bruised and bandaged because they tried this and essentially it stalled out. The systems changed, people left, it lost juice. And I wonder how much this half-life of skills idea drove decision-making everywhere from let's map every skill in our organization to, oh God, we've got to put together a micro-learning system. Like micro-learning is the way we've got to go in the future because we've got to respond so rapidly. Or we started devaluing content in a way. We all saw the news about what happened with Pluralsight, the way the PE firm has taken a write-off on that acquisition. And maybe there's a devaluing of the content itself, in part because AI can generate content, but in part because we all thought skills are going to change so frequently that like maybe we shouldn't put much effort into how we develop this. As a matter of fact, what we should do is just ship everybody a video and they can build a skill that way. And can we just all agree for a second, we don't really build skills by watching videos? Maybe you find a skill or two where you can do that, but like we learn about skills watching videos or reading an article. We build skills by doing and practicing and getting feedback. This is old school learning theory that like for a moment, I feel like we abandoned altogether because we all were afraid that the half-life of skills was falling so quickly. We were going to be irrelevant if we invested the kind of time and energy that it took to really build skills for the future.
I think this is interesting. We have noticed kind of the same thing. There seem to be fewer people doing sort of pie in the sky and much more people trying to figure out exactly what is needed for their organization. How would you recommend that leaders avoid maybe some of this bandwagon jumping for stats and models and other things like this?
We should all put these things through common sense. I think we're going to talk more about durable skills in a minute. But I was writing about this when literally the topic that I was on with you all last time, I was talking about durable and perishable skills. And it was me trying not at that point in time to like ignore the half-life of skills because it had taken on such a life that if I came out on a podcast and said that's utter BS without doing research, like everybody would have blown through it. But there was something to me that like it just didn't pass the sniff test. It didn't make sense. I had skills that had lasted. As a matter of fact, on the podcast, Stacia and I talked about being historians and the skills that we learned writing papers and doing critical research and how that still matters to our jobs. Those are like the building blocks of the very jobs that we do today. So I think that we all need to spend a little more time just doing some critical thinking. I think there are people that we imagine, I got to figure out how far I want to go with this. But like, I think there are people out there that we trust for guidance who are largely influenced by commercial interests.
What?
Yeah. I don't think we talk about that enough in HR. Like, I think there are some voices who right now, and particular individuals, but also organizations who are saying things that really help their go-to-market strategy. And the people who listen to it are like, yes, I'm going to take that slide, that stat, that infographic, and I'm going to put it back in my deck to my HR leader to make decisions. It feels like, I don't know, I can't say they're not, I'm not there with them, but it feels like people aren't actually spending time interrogating that stat. You know what? If there's a stat on a screen that someone is saying to you in a sales call, you should actually ask, what's the source of that? How big was the N? Like, you don't have to be a researcher. Nobody's asking everybody on this call to be a researcher, but you should just say, like, how big is the N? Meaning, how many people were involved in that research? How many people were in that survey? What industry? Were they all located in the same industry? Were they all in the same vertical? Did you cherry pick the people that you wanted to be a part of that stat or study? And I think that the second thing that we do, other than just interrogating so that we could avoid jumping on the bandwagons, is to ask ourselves, like, what will the long-term implications be of this decision? I think in general, there are always going to be people who bring new ideas and research. I hope that I share a couple data points throughout this call that are going to be novel to some of the people that are listening to it. And, you know, I'm happy talking a little bit about the research that led to those decisions. But I think for everybody, as you consider, should I adopt this technology, believe this concept, I think we should think about the now what. We talk a lot about it. I think a lot of organizations do. But at Guild, I will bring an interesting data point to the stage, and the team around me will go, so what, now what? What is the next step, and what are the implications of this? And I think that there are probably even people who are listening to this podcast who think to themselves, my decisions don't have that big of an impact. But I think many of us, we are literally the people who put systems in place. If we think about systems are the things that hold the world together and influence decision makers, if we're making decisions, we're influencing people making decisions, then we are establishing the systems. And your decisions either contribute to systems being established or dismantle systems and establish new ones. Systems are good, they give us scale, but we have to think about the knock-on effects of the systems we deploy, both technology systems and people systems. There are knock-on effects, and we should actually do some critical thinking about what that is before we put all the effort into deploying the technology or adopting the new approach.
Yeah. Definitely.
I completely agree with that. The question is, how do you get people to do that critical thinking? But we're not going to go there in this podcast.
I will say, though, the other thing I say, and fully acknowledging there's a self-serving component to that. So on the whole no BS, be clear thing, I often tell folks, if you are reading research or data that's available for free, somebody is paying for you to read it. Somebody is paying, somebody is trying to influence you to think a certain way. And yes, I acknowledge that as a research firm, I'm encouraging you to pay for your research because I believe that we create high quality, unbiased research. But fundamentally, that's part of what I believe and why I wake up and do what I do every day is because I think that the twisting of data and the twisting of reality to sell things, it's part of business, sure. But you as an HR professional should have somewhere you can go where that's not what you're encountering.
Yeah, I pay for a membership to RedThread, right?
That's
this is
true.
not a commercial.
And you paid like at the beginning.
I did.
But anyway, I'm not trying to totally commercial, but whether it's us or it's somebody else who you trust, be careful about what you read. Be careful about what you believe, I think is probably the key point.
Because there are HR practitioners who are listening to this, I'm not trying to do an expose. I'm not like the investigative reporter for everybody. But I lived as a practitioner and I had to read those reports and figure out what direction we go. Now, I've been on the other side, inside of a technology provider in this space. Y'all, I wrote this article on the half-life of skills. You may not agree with the way that I frame it, which is fine, but like the world should know that the concept of a half-life of skills is not a scientifically backed idea, and we should quit acting like it is in any form or fashion. Do you know that there are numerous publications in the HR space who wouldn't publish that piece until I paid them to publish it? As a vendor, I had to sponsor that content in order for that content to show up. And we finally found an outlet that didn't want us to pay them to publish that piece. But I would love to have put that in some places where I think it would get visibility by a lot of decision makers. But until I was willing to pay the price for that, it couldn't go there. And like, wow, y'all, like the content of this feels pretty important, not to like self-aggrandize. All my work isn't that important, but this one feels pretty important to like have a conversation about, but you can't say it unless you pay, which is crazy.
Agreed. So on that happy note, let's do a quick lightning round. All right. We talked a lot about skills. Matthew, what's your favorite hidden skill?
My own personal skill that is hidden is I'm really good at Googling. Is that possible? That's a skill?
Yeah, I think so.
So is that one degrading with prompt engineering now being the new thing?
So this is it, Stacia. Yes, it is. And I'm actually finding myself at a disadvantage. It's one of these things that I actually had this, like, I knew how to write the right minus and quotes and get to the answer. We'd be in a room full of people and somebody would say, I wonder what, blah, blah, blah. And like everybody would start searching and I could get there fast enough because I could write it. And I tried all of my tricks on ChatGPT and they didn't work. And I was like, oh, I have to write these statements with like the right prompts. Oh God, the half-life of my skill is falling.
Well, but Google's like 20 years old, right? So it actually has taken 20 years or something. Yeah, it's done all right.
It was one worth investing in, for sure. Second question, and this is a polarizing question for Station. Pineapple on pizza or no?
Absolutely not. Utter nonsense.
No.
Yep. As it should be.
I don't love savory sweet. That's not my thing.
No, I don't understand it either.
Yeah. No, I'm out.
Sweet or savory, that's it.
Yeah.
Choose one.
Yeah.
No. But I will give you this, Danny. We tried to make a pineapple fried rice this week. It was terrible. Did not work. So I will at least acknowledge that it's not always the answer, but on pizza it is. Anyway, what's the best piece of feedback you've ever received, Matthew?
I'm going to give you two. Here's one. My mom said to me, I was probably 7 or 8, and I was really frustrated because I didn't know something. And she said, son, you don't have to know all of the answers. You just have to know where to find them. And she taught me how to use an index and a glossary that day when I was like 7 or 8. And that has stuck with me since then. The second one, and I say this to people all the time, and there's always like a light bulb moment. I was in my first job and there was something that was happening and I was so upset about it. Surprise, surprise. And I was telling the boss how it should be different. And she said something really profound to me that has stuck with me over the years. You need to know the difference between a problem and a dilemma. Problems have solutions. Dilemmas have to be managed. You need to know when you're facing a problem and when you're facing a dilemma and act accordingly.
Wow.
That's
profound.
It's really good. There are a lot of people who spend a lot of time trying to solve dilemmas, and you're like never going to do it. And it's time to move on. So that's one of the best pieces of feedback I ever got.
I think I'm going to take that. Thinking about our research agenda, Danny.
Okay. It's always a dilemma. Never a problem.
Never a problem.
All right, we want to get into our second big theme. This one's a little bit more blue sky, Matthew.
Okay.
Let's start with this. How do you, as an individual, as you, Matthew Daniel, how do you think and talk about skills?
I think skills have two different definitions. Number one, and in a work context, it's the things we know, can do, and the ways of thinking that help us deliver on business strategy. And in that, they are like rich and deep and complex and meaningful. That's what a skill is. There is a second definition, which is they're a metadata tag that's applied to people, jobs, mentors, and courses. And in that way, it's shallow. It's ones and zeros. They have no meaning. They lack context. They just exist. And I think what is really interesting to me is that both of those definitions are existing at the same time. One is held by our systems, and one is held by us. Like realistically, we think that skills are big and complex. And that thing we were talking about a moment ago with companies moving more and more away from 30,000 skills and to the 50, 100, 200 that matter in their organization, increasingly organizations are understanding that it's the first definition, this deep, meaningful definition, rather than the shallow tagging, except for our technology isn't there. There is a chasm, and it is growing, between the way our systems frame skills and the way our organizations frame skills. And I think somewhere along the way, we got to figure that out.
I wonder if inherent in that is that in the first framing, there is context. You understand the context, and you understand also degree. We just wrote a report on skills validation. And yet most of the time, it is, to your point, binary. You either have the skill or you don't within the technology.
Yes, and we're seeing almost all of the vendors start to talk about that. Binary is not, it doesn't have the context. It can't help you make decisions. It's a terrible way to look at skills. But we are seeing richer things. And when we wrote that piece on skills verification, we also wrote about different types of verification that get you to that second definition, right? So we've talked to organizations that are like, yeah, for some jobs, it doesn't matter. We just want to know roughly, do they have the right skill set? For other jobs, maybe client-facing jobs, we want a portfolio. We want them to prove that they have those skills. We want to develop those skills as we go into it. And that's where the context and the richness comes.
Yeah, I think it was your podcast with the leader from McKinsey who talked about you have to actually put it on a gradient. That podcast I forwarded to a bunch of people in my organization. It was like, this is an unlock for me, because ultimately it was that, like, in some case studies, or in some, we refer to it often as jobs to be done. In this jobs to be done frame, the job to be done doesn't require that level of specificity or context. And I'm more comfortable here. In others, it's not. But I think it's interesting. Essentially, what we're seeing happening, you all are writing about an assessment, is that we're putting gradients around it. So now we're just putting that gradient is actually another 1 or 0. It's like 1 through 5 of a ranking or advanced through beginner. And we're just associating. Now what we've done is just tagged one metadata tag with another metadata tag. And that metadata tag, ironically or unironically, doesn't have any meaning in another organization or when you buy another content library. So we're back at that same challenge again.
If we're looking completely across, I completely agree. I don't know how we solve it by industry. We talked to Jennifer Rogers, who's trying to solve it for the whole world at IEEE. That was a really interesting conversation, but I think you're right there. I think the second thing to remember is that organizations are trying to make decisions based on skills. There are some decisions that you need that context and you need to see it and feel it and hear it and whatever to promote somebody or to move somebody on. Whereas if you're just trying to decide where to invest your L&D budget, maybe 80% of the information about whether or not the skill exists in your organization is enough. Do you have thoughts on that?
I don't. I think that's accurate.
Okay. In that first podcast, which we've referenced many times now, we talked a bit about durable and perishable skills. Can you first give a very quick definition of that and then tell us, have your thoughts on that changed?
Yeah. I've been talking and writing about this for some period of time. And essentially it was me backing into my belief that not all skills, the half-life of them diminished at the same rate. And so I wanted to try and separate out that there were skills that didn't diminish. And so I called those essentially durable skills. And what's interesting is folks want to make that a soft skill versus hard skill. And as I said earlier, Excel is a hard skill, but it's actually an extremely durable one, just as a point of reference. Ultimately, the concept behind it is that the half-life of some skills falls. Those are perishable. The half-life of some skills is longer. Those are durable. And we have to think of it a bit like an investment portfolio. For any one of our jobs, they actually require that we have these really deep, super durable skills consistently. And also to execute on what an organization needs, we also need to understand process, which is usually very perishable. We need to understand today's technology that we use to administer that thing, which is ultimately also very perishable, but critical to executing on the tasks that we have to do for our jobs. And so that was the idea behind it. Have my beliefs changed? Not entirely. I think they've matured. My belief update here is actually not that there are some that are durable and some that are perishable. I still hold to that. It is that we have to think like a portfolio in how we invest in skills, and that our investment should match the durability of a skill. In places where we, being the broader HR community, has divested from long-form learning, this is where I want to be clear. I have commercial interest in long-form learning. That is what Guild provides. But as a practitioner, there are places where longer form learning is merited because the skills being built are worth the investment. And we should acknowledge that and not believe that every skill is going to get thrown away like a carton of milk, right? Your skills don't go away at that same pace. That belief update for me has been less that there is something that changed, that it matters. And as a matter of fact, in an AI world, that durable skills are even more important, that we are thinking critically about how we build skills for the future.
Talk to us a little bit about skills as an equalizer within organizations.
Yeah.
I know this is a passion of yours.
It is. So here's my answer on that, which is essentially that if skills are the currency of the workplace, then how we distribute currency or skills matters. And if what we do is co-locate most of the perishable skills in one population, let's say, for example, frontline, and we co-locate most of the durable skills in a different population, let's say high potential or executives, and we farm out the perishable tasks from executives to the front line, then we are perpetually keeping a system in place that stratifies our talent so that those with more durable skills get to sit at the top of orgs and those with more perishable are forced to sit at the bottom. And we have less career mobility as a result of it. We have less economic mobility, which causes strain on the entirety of society. Are we going to fix all of society from L&D? Not going that far. But what I am saying is that we are a part of a system that contributes to it. And in the world of equity, I'm going to say it, folks who are from marginalized populations, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about sexual identity, what a lot of things that we're talking about, those folks are often stratified into more junior roles in an organization, which means that we are then connecting marginalized folks with more perishable skills and the less marginalized with more durable skills. And so I think thinking about it as a investment portfolio where you make sure you're making that investment across a whole lot of people matters.
But you can only do that if you have that data. Like if you're looking for that data, that's it.
Oh yeah, if you're not thinking about it, if we think of this like supply chain, if I am managing to the margins, then when I have a shock to the system, I'm not going to know how to respond. So that's from a business standpoint, but I also can't reallocate resources from one area to another just in the spirit of agility because my business needs it, because the market changes, because I've not located those skills in a broad enough population. And if I'm not intentional, it's a problem.
We wish we could continue, but we can't because we promised some Q&A time and we want to be cognizant of people's time. So 2 quick questions. You've got like 30 seconds to do both of these together. First one is, nutshell it for us. What's your one big takeaway from doing this research?
We as practitioners should thoroughly examine the data we're using to make decisions on systems and priorities and make sure that there's data to back up the investment that we're making. Find out what the research is, make sure that their point of view is supported.
Awesome. The final question, we ask this to everybody. We call it our purpose question. You've answered it before, but we want to hear again. Why do you do what you do?
Because I want to make the world better.
Oh,
I mean,
love that.
Because when people get connected with the right skills and opportunities, the world gets better. This is my way to have, I've talked about it since I started this career, is that we get to have generational impact in HR. We don't just make decisions for the individual in front of us. The decisions that we make, the way we give people access to jobs, training, development, mentors, coaching, all those things has knock-on effects for their children and their children's children. Look at it, look at the data, it's there. So we have to be really thoughtful. I want to be a voice in the market that is trying to drive equity and impact at a generational level with the decisions that we make.
Matthew, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Matthew.
My pleasure.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the RedThread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.